Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Melissa C. I'm a recovered compulsive overeater. I'm in New York and really happy to be here tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about, and by the way, welcome to all the people that are new here. We're really happy that you joined us. So tonight, last time I spoke, we went through step 5. And tonight's topic is sort of like oftentimes in between really 5 and 6, we create some kind of ideals. And it's a pretty common practice. People will look at their inventory, they'll see how they're not living in agreement with their ideals. And we're kind of called upon to create some relationship ideals. And really in the big book, it talks about a sex ideal. But we're also told that we can treat sex like any other problem. So, oftentimes, what we really require is some ideals for relationships. And so, tonight's topic is relationship ideals. And what I've done is, I've gone through the big book and I've sort of looked for what the book tells us, what the text tells us, are the ideals that really the big book lays out for us. So it's not just like my made up ideals, but it's really big book based ideals. And so I did put in the chat box, and I can either copy and paste it again because I know some of you came on afterwards. I'm going to see if I can just paste that in. There we go. So this is a document that I have. Oftentimes after I do this talk, I'll get I'll get people will reach out and say, I need that list. Like, where is that list? So I've given you access to it. You are free to look at it. And so I'm really going to go right through basically what it says about these ideals. I'll sort of bring my own understanding to it, my own experience to it, and see, hopefully it's helpful for you guys as well. So, what are ideals anyway? Like, what does that mean, even when we start saying ideals? Because doesn't ideal have something to do with perfection? Like, when we say ideal, there's like this perfection sort of image. And is that impossible? Like, are we talking about the impossible? Is it unattainable? Am I really supposed to be perfect? Is that what this is all about? And anyway, isn't perfectionism a flaw? Like, aren't we told like striving for perfection is a flaw? And page 68 in the AA 12 and 12, because I'll kind of be bouncing back and forth between the big book and the AA 12 and 12, it answers this question. And it says, many will at once ask, how can we accept the entire implication of step 6? So we're kind of like, at this step 6 kind of point. Why? That is perfection. This sounds like a hard question, but practically speaking, it isn't. Only step 1, where we made the 100% admission we were powerless over alcohol, can be practiced with absolute perfection. The remaining 11 steps state the measuring sticks by which we estimate our progress. The only urgent is that we make a beginning and keep trying. So while I don't always live in agreement with my ideals, it's the target, right? It's what I aim for. I'm imperfect, clearly, right? I'm imperfect, but I'm actually seeking perfection. I'm actually seeking spiritual perfection. And I'm directed to grow along spiritual lines. So I'm supposed to be consistently growing in that direction. In the doctor's opinion, in XVIII, it says, like, frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. In nearly all cases, their ideals, there's that word, must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. And so, the doctor's opinion, like we're always told, oh, it has a lot to say about food and alcohol and the allergy. And that's no doubt super important information. But there's also a lot more in that chapter or the pre-chapter, right? It's not really a chapter, it's the pre-chapter. And in the doctor's opinion, I also found out that food was never really my problem, right? That's not my real problem. My actual problem was a problem I had with living. I have a living problem. I had ideals that were grounded in me. Those were my ideals. And I had a personality disorder. Like that's what it says, personality disorder. And it's like, wait, what? You don't? You don't have a personality disorder? Because I think we're all here because we required a personality change sufficient enough to bring about recovery from compulsive eating. So our personalities, my personality was actually bringing me to ruin because it wasn't making me free from compulsive eating. I needed my life to be recreated. Like that's what it says. Ideals grounded in something bigger than yourself so that you can recreate your life, so that you can have a brand new life. And, in Bill's story, when Ebby comes in and sees Bill, and Bill sees the evidence, he looks at Ebby and he sees the evidence of someone who has ideals that are grounded in something bigger than himself. And it says this: I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped new soil. And like, what does that mean? Right? If somebody's roots are grasping new soil. And what I think it means is that, for me, I think about like my roots, right? What are our roots? They're the things that keep us in place, that hold us, where we are, fixes us in the spot. And it supports me, but it's also in charge of nourishing me. It's also in charge of taking in that which I need, right, to grow. And so for me, my old soil was soil that was polluted. It was polluted and corrupted because my roots were being fed and supported by fear, by selfishness, by getting what I wanted, and by my feelings. That's what my ideals were grounded in, right? Getting what I need and getting what I thought was going to feel right for me. And so what's the new soil? What's our new soil? Our new soil is actually soil that can really support us. Like it's actual clean, supportive soil. And it's our loving creator. It's a new set of spiritual principles. Because when our roots are selfish, right, then everything I'm taking in is going to support what I think I need, what I think is going to be good for me. So I take in all the information from the world that sort of supports what I think is in my own best interest. And that brought me to ruin. You know, there's a solution on page 19 through 20. It says, of necessity, there will have to be discussion of matters medical, physical, medical, psychiatric, social, and religious. We are aware that these matters are, from their very nature, controversial. Nothing would please us as much as to write a book which would contain no basis for contention or argument. We shall do our utmost to achieve that ideal. Most of us sense that real tolerance of other people's shortcomings and viewpoints and a respect for their opinions are attitudes which make us more useful to others. Our very lives as ex-problem drinkers depend upon our constant thought of others and how we may help meet their needs. So, hold on. So our ideal as ex-problem drinkers, as ex-problem eaters, here's the ideals it's spelling out. 1, we avoid controversy. Like that's an ideal for us. 2, we're not contentious or argumentative. 3, we're supposed to be tolerant of others' shortcomings. 4, respectful of others' viewpoints and opinions. 5, useful to others. And 6, constantly thinking how we can meet their needs. So what does this mean, right? If I avoid controversy, it's like for me, I try as best as I can not to jump into political arguments or workplace drama. Like, I'm not jumping on the bandwagon when people have disputes. I'm not getting in the middle of it. I'm supposed to seek to be a peacemaker. I'm supposed to seek peace. And, you know, for me, it's like I have to work to let the rumor, when there's a rumor, to let it die with me, like not to pass it on when I get a piece of information. You know, I, when my family members are fired up over something, and I'm part of a very big, opinionated family, I'm directed to stay quiet or positive. Like when there's a big debate over something and everybody's getting worked up over something, I actually have to utilize my willpower, right? Willpower might not work where food is concerned, but it absolutely can work when living in agreement with our ideals. So it means I may have to use some willpower to pull back from getting involved in the chatter, you know, and I sometimes what it means for me is I have to stay quiet. I have to close my mouth. I have to say nothing. And the people I love, just like me, were imperfect and they make mistakes. And I know that I have this incredibly analytical eagle eye. And it like boop, 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 boop. It spots everyone else's mistakes. It is so good at finding everyone else's flaws. And and for me, I kind of see it as like big neon signs, like pointing at it. Like, here I am, mistake, mistake. Not mine, mind you, other people's, right? I'm really good at seeing the flaws in other people. And and then I feel like it's demanding me that I point it out, that I change them or talk about it with others. And that's clearly not tolerant of other people's shortcomings, right? That is like calling attention and being critical of other people's shortcomings. And so, why can't, like, why can't I do that? Like, let's say, my mother in law, right? And I love my mother in law, but my husband might be upset over something his mom does and he might bring it up with me. Why can't I get in there and like agree with him and like support him on it and like jump in there? When he tells me something that his mom said that bothered him, why can't I just add some more like morsels to the discussion? Like keep it going, right? Well, it's not respectful, right? It's not respectful of her views and her perspective, and it's not useful. It's not useful. Well, it's not certainly not useful to her, and it's not useful to my husband, right? I want to help be a peacemaker amongst family members. And it's truly much kinder towards him actually to not agree, to not just automatically take his side. And I can spot it for myself because recently something happened where a family member upset me over something. And I was so tempted. I was driving home and I was like, oh my gosh, I know I'm not supposed to bring it up to my husband. Because remember, my husband doesn't have this disease. So he doesn't have to have the same ideals. He can agree with me and take my side if I'm upset over a family member. But I have to be very careful what to bring to our conversation because even though it might feel good in the moment to have him say, like my brother upset me over something, right? So I would tell my husband, and then he could agree and say, your brother's a jerk or whatever. And then it actually isn't good for me. It's not good for me. It's not good for my brother, my relationship with my brother. And it's actually not good for my husband either. It's not good for anybody. So I have to use willpower to stay out of doing that. And in my case, I had to use like sponsee power. I had a sponsee call. And that was enough to like, I told her what was happening because I have these ideals. I'm imperfect, but I'm shooting for it. Right. So, you know, I think like it's so much kinder when we stay out of it because, God molds our ideals. And I'm like, let's say an example for my husband and his mom. Like, I believe in a God that wants sons and mothers to love one another and have peace together. I believe that. I think that's a good ideal. And I'm supposed to participate, right? If my roots are grasping new soil, I want to bring that. I want to bring that into my soil. I want to bring that into my roots. So, rather than criticize, I'm to look for how I can be helpful and useful. And, what strikes me also is that it says constantly, thinking constantly of others, right? So that's not occasional and it's not even frequent, it's constant, and so we're not promised more leisure time or time to pursue our interests and desires. We get it, but actually, my ideals can't be shaped around me and my desires. And I found too, that if I trash talk family members with another family member, um, I'm part of me is looking to feel closer at the expense of another person, and that's called cheap intimacy. That's feeling intimacy at the expense of someone else. And that is not aligned. That's not aligned with my ideals, right? So let's look and see what other characteristics help shape our ideals. And in Dr. Bob's Nightmare on page 180, it says, "It is a most wonderful blessing to be relieved of the terrible curse with which I was afflicted. My health is good, and I have regained my self respect and the respect of my colleagues. My home life is ideal, and my business is as good as can be expected in these uncertain times." So, what does Dr. Bob have to offer about an ideal? Well, if we look at what attracted him and his wife to the people in the Oxford group, which he was pointing out that their lives were ideal, we can learn something about what he saw as ideal. And he talks about the time of this beer experiment. He was thrown in with a crowd of people who attracted me because of their seeming poise, health, and happiness. They spoke with great freedom from embarrassment, with which I could never do. And they seemed very much at ease on all occasions and appeared very healthy. More than these attributes, they seemed to be happy. So here's what he was seeking. It's clear he was seeking: one, poise; two, health; three, happiness; four, freedom from embarrassment; five, at ease on all occasions. And I think those five characteristics, those are the byproducts of living in agreement with God's will. Like, we get those things when we live in agreement with what we believe God's will is. So poise, when it talks about poise is being comfortable in your own skin, right? It's feeling okay. People have poise. They learn from their mistakes, they apologize if necessary, and they move forward. When they make a mistake, they admit it, they don't fall apart, right? They recognize their humanity and they have humility about it. And they can exhibit humility and confidence. They can hold their head up. They are not cocky, they're not arrogant. A poised person generally doesn't lose their cool. They're patient. I think, like, people that are poised, I consider them lifelong learners, able to learn from their own mistakes, and they continue to grow and accept new ideas and new perspectives. And so when creating my ideals, I seek to live with poise. I want to have poise. And, it makes me think of the men and women that I've met in the rooms of Overeaters Anonymous, the ones who did such a good job of carrying the message to me, because they drew me in, because they were bright eyed, right? They were quiet, they were sane, they weren't evangelists or reformers, right? They were calm about it. I didn't feel the weight of them trying to convert me or persuade me. And, after our fifth step, too, we begin to get some of the qualities that a poised person has. I can easily recognize when I'm not exhibiting poise. You know, when my kids were younger, I would come home from work and I would have had a list of things that I expected to have been done. Like the kids got home earlier than me, and I had these expectations of the things that my children should have done. And none of them, I'd come home sometimes and none of them would be done. And I didn't respond always in like, in the best way, right? I certainly wasn't quiet. I certainly wasn't sane about it. I can definitely act like a reformer and I would lose my cool. And it's not a pretty moment when we walk in the door like that. And by the way, when I would walk in the door like that, it never gave me the thing that I was actually wanting in the first place, which in this case for me, it was like a calm and happy home. I thought if I came home and there were no dishes in the sink, right? And things were put away and the garbage was brought back up to the garage instead of at the curb, that I would feel that calmness, right? I would feel like, oh, it was good. Except when you come in like a tyrant having a temper tantrum because those things weren't done, you don't get that calm, peaceful feeling that you thought. And if I'm throwing a temper tantrum and I'm banging, for me, like I put things away and I bang the pots and pans and grumble and carry on, that, I'm not living in agreement with my ideal, right? I'm not bringing peace and calmness into my home. So, in how it works, it says this on page 69: we do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. We all have sex problems. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. What can we do about them? We reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom did we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Were we at fault? What should we have done instead? We got this all down on paper and looked at it. So, according to our deal there, it says we can't be selfish, so we have to think of others first. Can't be dishonest, right? You have to be truthful. And can't be inconsiderate. You have to have consideration for other people. And we review the way we behave, and our new ideal can't arouse jealousy. So we don't brag or discuss things that we know another person is longing for. We don't throw things in other people's face. We're compassionate. We make, we don't want to make people suspicious. So we encourage people to trust us. Basically, you make people suspicious when you're untrustworthy, when you're dishonest, when you're two-faced. And I would say the greatest way that I found that one person can make another suspicious is if you are, and I think a lot of what I'm going to kind of talk about is like talking about other people. If I'm talking about somebody to you, I'm actually arousing suspicion in you, because everybody knows that if I'm talking bad about someone else to you, I mean, I've had that experience where somebody gossips to me about another person. I'm now very suspicious of the person that was gossiping to me because I know they're gossip, right? I don't want to be that. I don't want to be that. I don't want to be drumming up that sort of feeling, and I know the people, like, I think about them at work. They're the ones like you walk in the door and they can't wait to pin you down and tell you about so and so around the corner. And they're doing the same thing about you. I can't be that person. I have to refrain. It's difficult. It's really difficult withdrawing from cheap intimacy because it means that sometimes you're going to feel alone, right? But what's my ideal, right? Where is my real sense of belonging? Is it going to come at the expense of another person? Or is it going to come from the real sense of belonging I get from my relationship with my creator? That is a much more long lasting sense of belonging. So in my relationships, I am to be compassionate, honest, and fair. On page 69, the second paragraph says, in this way, we tried to shape a sane and sound ideal for our future sex life. We subjected each relation to this test. Was it selfish or not? So I would say this in every relationship, as a mom, as a wife, as an employee, as a colleague, as a neighbor, as a sponsee, as a sponsor, to not be selfish. Now, in our way of life, right, in our set of directions, selfish isn't only just wanting my more than my fair share, right? For me, it's also wanting others to follow my script, right? That's selfishness. When I expect others to do what I want them to do, when I have this thing like they should, dot, 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 or not seeing another person's point of view, believing that my perspective is fact, you know, or like wanting things my way, right? It's got to be my way. Selfish is also like wanting special treatment, wanting to be like treated better than other people. It's also too concerned with me, even worried what others are thinking about me, and wanting to be good, wanting to look good or be liked. All of those are a form of selfishness. And so when I find that my thoughts are like really circling me and how everything is affecting me, that's selfish, right? So it's like I have this situation where a sibling is in the country right now, unexpected, I didn't know. And my immediate reaction, because he didn't notify me, is all about me. Like, how did he not notify me? How did he, and that's selfish. And then when I thankfully comes to my attention, I'm not the only person in his life. You know, I'm like one of many. I'm not the starring role. He's got children, he's got grandchildren, he has other things. It's not to me. It's not he didn't contact me to do anything to me. It's that I'm not the center of his universe. And when I think I am, that's selfish. That's selfishness. Believing that I'm the starring role in everybody's story in my life, right? So we ask God to mold our ideals and help us to live up to them. We remembered always that our sex powers were God given and therefore good, neither to be used lightly or selfishly, nor to be despised or loathed. And I see that not just our sex, our sex powers, but all of our attractive powers, meaning all of our talents, all of our gifts are God given. It might be intelligence, it might be artistic gifts. Some people have really great people skills. Some people have like excellent athletic abilities. Anything. Some people are like highly organized. They're really good at like having good organizational skills. And anything that makes us special is God given and therefore good and not to be used lightly or selfishly. God will use these gifts and we must allow him to mold us. And I think one of the most amazing things is how so many of our troubling characteristics become reshaped into ones that are beneficial if they're put to good use. And, in step 3, we turned our will and our lives over to God. And in step 7, we give him everything, good and bad, right? And then we get back what God wants us to have and wants us to work on. Page 69, the third paragraph says, whatever our ideal turns out to be, we must be willing to grow toward it. We must be willing to make amends where we've done harm, provided that we do not bring about still more harm in so doing. So at this point, right, we're doing all this, the food is down. Clearly the food is down, and it has been for a good chunk of time usually, right? We have a clear idea of our defects, or at least what our grosser handicaps are. We begin to feel more and more God directed. And around this time, we start getting more aware of when we're not living in agreement with our moral code. We can feel it. And this to me is what it means to have God shaping our ideals. Nobody should specifically tell you what your ideals are, but we know them. We know them. They've always been there. It's that quiet voice inside that we've always heard, you know. I have to say, my second grade students have it. They all have it. They actually all, they get a funny look on their faces when they're not doing what they know is right. Like they get this, like, I could see it in their expression. I know, like, I give my kids something to do on their Chromebook, and I know by the look on their face when they're not on the site that they're supposed to be on. It's like, so we all know, even at a young age, even at an advanced age, we know when we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. And it's not always, I have to say, it's not always because they fear the teacher's consequences that they get that look, but it's because they know. And I would say for me, I call that sense of knowing, it's the quiet voice of God within. It's that quiet voice of God that's inside all of us. And we call it our conscience. It's our conscience. It's now everybody's is different, but whatever yours turns out to be, you need to be willing to grow towards it. And when you don't live in agreement with your ideals, you make amends. We have to make the amends and not just say you're sorry, but actually amend the behavior, fix it, change it, do it differently. Remember that willing doesn't mean wanting, but it means you're going to do it anyway. And so, like a couple weeks ago, I said something to a colleague of mine. I was really like crabby, and I was complaining and complaining and complaining about my class. I was complaining and complaining about the professional development that we have. I was complaining and complaining about the new programs that we have. I was like, I caught the ear of my friend across the hall, and it's cheap intimacy because she goes right, like we connect over it. And I was on and on and on and on. And then I come home and I feel, I would say it's almost like you feel after you eat a bag of potato chips, like that greasy, gross feeling. And I know that is, I can feel when I'm not living in agreement with my ideals. And as uncomfortable as it is, I went back the next morning and I'd said to her and to other colleagues that had been like the victim of my like rant negativity. And I said, I just want to apologize because I've been extremely negative the last few days. And I don't want to bring that energy into our workplace. Like, I really like you guys. I really respect you. I don't want to be that person that's just grumbling and negative all the time. I want to like look to be better. And what's really beautiful is like this way of life, people do notice it. This colleague said to me, you know what, I have to say, she goes, Melissa, I have to say that I've noticed before, like sometimes you'll come back and say that. She goes, and then you really are good about being positive. And so, yeah, imperfect though, right? Remember, I said I'm imperfect. This is my ideal. Clearly, she knows I've had to make this amend before. So I've fallen off before, you know, but it's the bullseye I'm shooting for. It's and I'm if I'm poised, then I have the humility to admit when I'm screwing up and I can look people in the eye and try to do better, right? And so that's really what this is about. You know, um, so it says on page 70, like, all right, suppose you fall short, right? Well, you fall short of your chosen ideal and you stumble. Does this mean you're going to get drunk? Like, are we going to go right back to the food because we fall off of our ideal? Um, in the book, it says, well, some people tell us so, but this is only half true. It depends on us and on our motives. If we're sorry for what we've done and have the honest desire to let God take us to better things, we believe we'll have been forgiven, we'll have been forgiven, and we will have learned our lesson. If we're not sorry and our conduct continues to harm others, we are quite sure to drink. We are not theorizing. These are facts out of our experience. So if I make a mistake, if I don't live according to my God molded ideals, am I going to automatically go back to eating? Well, I have to check my motives. Am I really sorry? Do I want to do better? Or am I hoping to get away with something? I can't deliberately hurt someone and stay sober. That's what it says. You can't purposefully hurt another person and continue to live in sobriety and abstinence, even if you think they deserve it, right? Because we're not the arbiter, we're not the judge, we're not in charge of doling out consequences for people. So if I get back to that situation, right, where I, the time when I came home and none of the household chores were done. Now, I was right, technically, right? Because I asked my kids to do it, and that was the expectation. Um, but I had to make amends for coming home and having a temper tantrum like a 2-year-old. Like, that's my part. I have to own my behavior. And if I don't make an amend right away, I'm actually risking my recovery. And I think about it my life, I'm actually risking my life. And so when I drill down on it, I might be technically right for expecting the kids to have done their chores, done what I asked. But if I am going to die on that battle, then I'm saying that the clean house that I long for is worth dying over. Like, it is worth my life. And that's crazy, right? That's just crazy. Another thing that I absolutely cannot do if I plan on staying recovered and protected is I can't lie. I can't be dishonest. Why? Because, I've heard Janet say it's like we put a do not enter sign on our foreheads when we do that. It's like we tell God to keep out. And what I think about is when I lie, what I'm really saying to God is, I don't trust you. I'm not interested in your plan. I have a plan and I'll manipulate the truth so my plan happens. Back off, right? Leave me alone. Back off. I got it. I'd say lies basically tell God, I don't need your help. I'm not interested in being helped today. I got it. And, for me, I think like this about God. I think God is the most skillful teacher with the perfect lesson plan that's differentiated for each and every one of us. He knows exactly what I need to learn. And when I lie, what I'm saying to God is, I don't need to learn anything from you. Thank you very much. Right? Not interested in learning. And so, God gives me free will. He lets me decide for myself. If I'm not interested in learning, okay. What I found though is that God's will be done. And so if I don't get the lesson the first time, it's not going away. I'll get an opportunity. Usually it requires a more harder lesson, right? It seems to sting a little more. Page 70, the second paragraph says, to sum up about sex, well, we pray for the right ideal, for guidance in each questionable situation, for sanity, and for the strength to do the right thing. If sex is very troublesome, we throw ourselves the harder into helping others. We think of their needs and we work for them. This takes us out of ourselves. It quiets the imperious urge, that impulse, that hunger. It quiets that hunger. And so in all my relationships, I pray for this. I pray for the right model. I pray for help and I pray for clarity. And when I'm unsure and confused, I pray for rational and stable thinking, for clear thinking, and for the strength, for God's power to do what is right. And if a situation is difficult and overly tempting, then I throw myself into being of service. I focus on someone else's needs and I make that my project. I have to get out of myself, right? So if I'm overly focused on me, how something bothered me, how something hurt me, I actually have to get that replaced by what I can do to be useful for other people. And how it works on page 66, it says if we were to live, we have to be free of anger. The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics, these things are poison. And that's a phrase I turn to a lot because it reminds me that as an ex problem eater, I have a very unique set of directions. It's very different from the directions that normal people have. I cannot defend and support my side and my position. In fact, I actually am told I have to divorce myself, separate, disconnect, turn away, abandon, distance, split, and detach myself from that kind of thinking. I have to like put up a wall between me and that kind of thinking. And in Into Action on page 83, it tells us that we should be sensible, tactful, considerate, and humble without being servile or scraping. As God's people, we stand on our feet. We don't crawl before anyone. And so what this tells me is that although in my ideals, I am putting other people's needs ahead of my own, it's ahead, but it doesn't mean that my needs are never to be considered. Of course, my needs are going to be considered. It's just not going to be considered first, right? But it will be considered. I think about it like this. I am a child of my creator. And I believe that it's disrespectful to God to be putting myself in a position where I am courting humiliation, where I'm looking to be humiliated, where I'm looking to, get experiences of pain and abuse. I'm not supposed to do that. We're not servile. We're not scraping. We're of service to God, and He directs us who and how to help, but we're not at the beck and call to other people, not to our sponsors, not to our sponsees, not to our families, not to our fellows, or to any other human being. I don't believe that God relieved me of the bondage of food to be anyone's doormat. I don't believe that that's why I got out from under this disease. So my ideals have to be healthy. I have to have healthy boundaries in there too, right? And those of us who've been people pleasers have actually not been as kind as we like to believe, right? Actually, we've been using others. When you're a people pleaser, you're using other people. You're not really concerned with their happiness and well being, but we don't like the thought of someone not liking us or being displeased with us. So the things we do to make others feel good is actually a transaction, right? It's basically, I will buy myself some comfort by making sure you're happy. Then I'll be okay, right? I'll be satisfied when you're happy. And in a way, that's a pretty unkind thing to do. When you make other people responsible for your happiness, it actually becomes a burden to them, right? Because now not only they have to be worried about their happiness, but now they're in charge of your happiness and people feel the pressure. Don't think for a second that you keep it to yourself. People can feel when you're doing things to make them happy because you need them to be happy yourself. It puts pressure on other people. So, if I get back to that housework example, it's a great example. In a calm demeanor, I can discuss in the morning what needed to get done. I can remind my children of their obligations, that as family members, they have things that they need to do as part of being a member of our family. And I can be quiet, I can be sane, basically poised, right? And it's a lot more effective. Now, it also doesn't always mean that they're going to do what I wanted, right? Not always, but I can follow through on the consequences if they're not done. And, or sometimes I just let the natural consequences like do the teaching and I can stand by and allow my kids to feel their own discomfort. Right. So it's like, yeah, you were asked to do that. And, you know, if you didn't do that, you're not going to be able to borrow the car. And then it's, I'm sorry, you know, it wasn't done. And they might not like it, but it's not my job is not to make sure everybody's happy with me so that I feel okay. Right. Sometimes as a parent, it's no, right? This is what it is. You know, page 84 says our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And in the St. Francis prayer, sometimes referred to the 11th step prayer, it talks about this. My function, my job is to be understanding, not understood, helpful, useful, valuable. You know, it says too that love and tolerance of others is our code. And I would say that's like my favorite line of all. I actually got that tattooed on my arm. Love and tolerance of others is my code. And for me, my code is it's my policy. It's my protocol. It's my standard operating procedure. So my code is not justice and fairness. I it's not like right and wrong. It's love and tolerance. And I need to have tolerance of others. And I need to tolerate, which means build up my sensitivity to my own discomfort that might get stirred up when others do whatever it is they do, right? I have to have a thicker skin to be less sensitive. You know, it says we've ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol. We avoid retaliation or argument. We take a kindly and tolerant view. We don't fight. We don't get people back. We don't go back and forth with others. You know, it says in to wives, it says in the chapter to wives that page 118, we women carry with us a picture of the ideal man, the sort of chap we would like our husbands to be. It is the most natural thing in the world, once his liquor problem is solved, to feel that he will now measure up to that cherished vision. And the chances are he will not. For like yourself, he is just beginning his development. Be patient. So now that I'm living free of the food, right? Now that I'm living in recovery, I cannot expect perfection. I can't expect it at home. I can't expect it in the workplace. I can't expect it in the world just because I'm doing better. With my loved ones, I need to be patient. And with myself, I need to be patient. And I remember that these are ideals. They're the perfect model. And although I can strive for the target, I, imperfect, will often miss the mark. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you so